After 3 years hiatus due to COVID, we are back celebrating each year the memory of our very good colleague Chitra Biswas, a beloved member of the defunct Department of Anatomy and Cellular Biology that transformed after two steps into the Department of Immunology. So Chitra was a faculty in the Department of Anatomy and Molecular Biology. Sorry, what a slip. And she passed away in 1993, so exactly 30 years ago. She discovered that EMPRIN, a cellular matrix metalloproteinase inducer, was secreted by epithelial cells in cancer, and that induced the secretion of metalloproteinases and was supposed to be part of the way in which epithelial tumors help themselves to invade. This was now has ramifications. It seems EMPRIN is important for the development of cones in the retina, etc. But we know that there are only 20,000 or 22,000 genes. So of course they intervene in multiple aspects of development. So in any case, we want to celebrate her memory, bringing speakers that either work on stroma epithelium interactions in development or in general themes that interest her, like, for example, the world in which we live as faculty, students, etc., in a university milieu. And after this hiatus, we thought it was appropriate to reevaluate this world where we live today. And that is why we invited Yuri, that is going to talk. Oh, this thing doesn't work for me. Okay. Thank you. So we are going to introduce Carlos Sonnenschein, that is going to introduce Yuri, that is going to talk about science as a canary in the Frankenstein coal mine. Carlos.
Okay, today's speaker, our friend and dear friend, Yuri Lazebnik, was educated in the State University of St. Petersburg in Russia, where he got degrees in biology and biochemistry. And in the early 90s, he moved to the States and spent some time, 3 years at Johns Hopkins. Then he moved to Cold Spring Harbor, where he spent almost 20 years and got to become a professor there. Then he moved to Yale and eventually decided to strike on his own and became a consultant and created a startup that he says it works, which is good always. Now, separately, Yuri, and that is how we met and appreciated his input, was always interested in the creative mind. And as a result of that interest, he observed and criticized, and as you will see, very candidly exposed his ideas. And again, I think that we are fortunate to have Yuri tell us what he thinks about what's going on these days in the mind. So, Yuri, thank you for coming.
I'll use this one. Oh, okay. Do you hear me? Thank you very much, Carlos and Anna, for the introduction, and first of all, for inviting me here. And a lot of things that I'm going to talk about actually were prompted by Carlos, who advised me that rather than to keep thoughts for myself, to write it up and publish it, and which proved me that sometimes you just don't know if something will, what you can call fly or distribute and make an impact, and some of it did. So what I'm going to tell you is that a view of a cell biologist or what's happening in science, first from inside and then looking like me from the bleachers. And I hope that it will help you to see what's happening to you. And if not, hopefully you'll just have it as an opinion. So first about canaries. So canary is a little bird, as you know, and it was saving a lot of people because in coal mines, and there's still coal mining is a dangerous enterprise and people die. And one of the killers is carbon monoxide. It doesn't smell, but it explodes and it can suffocate a person. And John Haldane in 2013, a physiologist, suggested that who worked on respiration to use small animals as sensors. Now there are electronic sensors in each house. At that time, sensors were not available, and people were saving each other by taking the birds with them. And once it shows signs of distress, it was time to get out of there or do something. And it became like a metaphor for anything that can sense a problem. So what I'm going to say, hopefully you'll see the rest of the title. We'll meet some Frankensteins. And I should start by saying that when I came to the United States, which was 32 years ago, I felt like it was science heaven. Maybe I was lucky because I got in good institutions, but I was really enjoying seeing, first of all, freezers full of reagents and things that I could do experiments with. But most importantly, the level of discussions. There were no holds barred, and everything was allowed. And it didn't matter if you're a graduate student, the chairman of the department, they would scream at each other to find out what's actually truth. And then, I started to see that things kind of started to slide in the direction that I didn't like, but I thought it's just my problem. And, I'm getting older and, getting grumpy and so on. But then when I saw this title in a science magazine, it's like, can NIH innovate the biomedical workforce? And the workforce, I think the term they use now is, triggered me. I just shivered. I didn't know what it is doing in this title in a science magazine, because my associations due to my background was with this poster. It's a poster from the time of post-revolution and in Soviet Union, and the word workforce was something that I was studying, doing all these political subjects, and we had to go and study, workforce, who said workforce what and what, and in general, this idea, this association triggers with me this thinking about the general philosophical, if you want, question. I'm not a philosopher, but in everyday life is, are you an individual or a cog in a machine? Because depending on how you answer this question, it defines how you work. If you have a lab and somebody you want to work, really do the best they can, if you tell the person it's a cog, it's not going to happen. So first, my reaction was maybe I'm just again getting older and getting exaggerated. And I looked up, so the word came in 1931 in the English language, and this poster was published in 1932. I asked my daughter what she feels about the sport, and she graduated from Columbia with majoring in English literature. So she said it sounds creepy. And I asked Mike Joyner, who will meet later in the talk, and he said it sounds like something written by an apparatchik. It's a member of communist apparat, because the word renovate applies to buildings, but not to people. So I kept it in mind, but I got a feeling that it has something to do with what's happening around me. And then lo and behold, I opened another issue of Science a couple of years later, and I read on the left side that, in Malaysia, a large part of plantation workforce is hired on a daily hot basis. Then I look at the right side and I see the percentage, really the next page, the percentage of the scientific workforce that is under the age of 35 is now much lower. So I mean, as they highlighted it in the paper published, this it just didn't make sense to me how you can deal with scientists as a plantation workforce and still expect to have some outcome. And the outcome in biomedical research is obviously drugs and knowledge and so on. So you know, it was clearly something I had in mind. But then the paper came out in 2014, acknowledging that there are not just some problems related to old people who misunderstand what's happening around, but this is something systemic happening in biomedical research, and this needs to be addressed. So they listed a bunch of, you know, what you can call symptoms. I added some in my wording, but the question was, what is causing them all? And the explanation they gave is that, like you can call Malthusian explanation, is that the amount of money allocated to biomedical research does not go fast enough relative to the number of people to do biomedical research. And the logic is there is not enough money, people get nasty and they start, you know, killing each other, you know, on the throats and so on and so forth. I thought this explanation is, you know, not quite, you know, credible. First of all, I can explain, you know, I can, you know, be sympathetic with NASA scientists who think that the universe expands as much as, you know, impossible. But I would find it difficult to believe that people who have a brilliant scientists and are great administrators would not understand that anything on this earth cannot expand indefinitely. Plus, it was clear that it's unrelated to biomedical research per se, because the same problems are found in medicine and in other areas. So another explanation was that I entertained, and it was written a lot about it. I called it businessification. The argument is that something happened in the research because biomedical institutions started to behave as businesses. So instead of continuing to be universities, they started to pretend they're companies, they, you know, presidents, CEOs, and all other things. And this also, it could explain some effects of what was happening, some symptoms. But it also didn't make very much sense to me, because first of all, it didn't explain why would somebody decide to run a university as a business. And second, when you look at what businesses and basic science do, they have different purposes, making profit and discoveries. They, you know, do different things. They process everything, and they interacting with each other all the time. So when I was considering that, I realized that what's actually happening, these two things fused into one. And rather than, you know, producing discoveries or making profit, it created an institution which I call Frankenstein, because it's made from different parts. And this institution has one purpose, is to maintain, thank you, one purpose is to maintain and expand the institution. So they say a university wants to get more money to make the university bigger, to make more money, and so on and so forth. And this is what the first diagnosis was admitted. And this didn't look good to me, because once my scientific side, we worked on the problem of what happens when you fuse two cells, because say you have different cells, you put them together. How do they reconcile? You know, what would be the final outcome? And what we came to understand with Alexei, who is a theoretical physicist, that the result of combining any system, including the gene expression system, is highly unpredictable. And what you would get, you would never know. And one possibility is say you can get cancer. But the final thing why I thought that businessification is not the final explanation, because what I realized is that something changed with people. Something changed with people in the way they think. And I found it by reading the report by Vannevar Bush, who actually graduated from Tufts. He was a faculty here before he moved to MIT, was, you know, faculty in engineering. And during the war, he was in charge of scientific research related to defense, including the Manhattan Project. So he wasn't just some kind of poet sitting at a couch. But what he wrote was very different from what was written some years later. And he wrote a report to Roosevelt, about how to develop science in the United States. So if we can just compare them side by side, which I did before, when I looked at it, if you look at the left, you see the title is Science, the Endless Frontier, something poetic, opening, right? Here we have Biomedical Research Workforce Working Group Report. It's something like Google translated from German, right? So there we see no one can select from the bottom those who will be the leaders at the top, because unmeasured and unknown factors enter into scientific or any leadership. Their brain and character, strength and health, happiness and spiritual vitality, interest and motivation. No one knows what else that must needs enter into this supramathematical calculus. Here we have in 2012, the study concluded that the level of PhD production in 1998 exceeded the availability of jobs. Conceptual frameworks were developed to provide static models of the workforce, one each for the PhD and MD PhD workforces. The committee chose not to recommend reduction in the large postdoctoral pool directly, but to make changes early in the training pipeline and allow workforce supply and demand to self-correct. So when I read it, it was like reading, sitting at a study section and looking at a grant application saying how many rats they need and what qualities and how they're gonna assure me that they can produce them. It was a very strange feeling. Why would well-intentioned people would talk about, their trainees in this way? This was very strange. So I thought it has to be some kind of doctrine that changed how people think. And I didn't know what it is. And then it was, as this happens in science, like a chance, Carlos sent me a paper by a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. And this paper led me to watch a movie about him. And he mentioned the word neoliberalism. And it struck me in two ways. First of all, he formulated what is neoliberalism, a program for destroying collective structures may impede pure market logic. So it sounded like something scary, even though I didn't understand why would somebody go and destroy something like this. And second, what struck me, because I didn't know what this neoliberalism was. I mean, I was watching TV at that time, but I never heard it. So I decided to read. And it led to very interesting discoveries that I think it helped me to understand what's happening. So it turns out it was an economist, an Austrian economist working in London School of Economics, Friedrich von Hayek. And he had truly a brilliant idea, if you think about it, with no sarcasm. And the idea was that we are used to the idea of a market as something where you sell pipette tips, pipettes, pigs, or ships or whatever. He said that the market is a system that can regulate any human interactions to exchange anything. So this is why the paper, the use of knowledge in society, knowledge in general terms about knowing I can move this, you can move that, I know how to solve equation. So, and the problem he found, it's marvelous, as he says, I'm convinced that this mechanism will be a marvel, because what many people and economists and philosophers and politicians trying to understand at that time, how to change the system that a society used to operate, so not to repeat World War I, revolutions, fascism and everything else. They wanted something new. And what Hayek said, which is also brilliant, he said, all problems of humans, because humans make decisions, and humans, we know what humans are. And instead of humans, if we have a market, something like a supra-human, a supercomputer that would regulate all human interactions, then we will avoid wars, and all other pests of human existence. So he was very straightforward about what this implies, because this is what it implied. It implied that everyone and everything should be a commodity, including you. So if you hear sell yourself for this is from there. Second, that everyone and everything has a monetary value, a price, literally. Everyone is a buyer and a seller, always. You sell if you hear about I sell my paper, this is where it's coming. More trader means fairer prices. This is why all organizations need to be dissociated to maximize the number of players. Because otherwise, say, a trade union would act at the market as one thing. Your purpose in life is to respond to market signals. And, I'm not making any sarcasm here. And the purpose of the state, which is critical, is not before as it used to be in economic liberalism, to just stay away from business, is to protect this business, the marvel of market, and do whatever masculine needed to do it. So this concept became known as neoliberalism, because liberalism is a situation where the state is staying away from business, let it do by itself, and neo is new. And just to make as an example of what they meant, to me, this was where I kind of realized what is. So this is a quote from Milton Friedman from his book, Capitalism Freedom. I have to read here. To put this in the different, what may seem a more callous perspective, children are at one and the same time consumer goods and potentially responsible members of society. The freedom of individuals to use the economic resources as they want includes the freedom to use them to have children, to buy, as it were, the services of children as a particular form of consumption, or once this choice is exercised, and so on. So the thing is, you read it, I don't know, if I would say my children that I exercise the consumption of the services, they would realize that that is crazy, even more crazy than they think he is. So then, but the question really, how do you convince people that children are a commodity? And you convince to the extent that they buy your books by millions, give you a Nobel Prize, and consider you like a marvel of human existence. And the answer was to Hayek by learning from your enemies. So his enemies were socialists. And socialists come in two flavors, basic flavor. One flavor is on your left, right? It's like men with arms. But there is another flavor, and this is one of my favorite quotes, that all reasonable people adapt to the environment, but unreasonable adapt the environment to them, therefore their progress depends on them. And this is by Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, and he was putting his action where his mouth is, and he set up a society. He didn't set up, he was one of the first active players there, called the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society exists till now. The purpose original was to exterminate private property, which is like socialism, the goal. And now they rephrased as radical long-term goal. But the most interesting part for Hayek and for us comes from the word Fabian, because Fabian was an emperor who was known for, he defeated Hannibal. And the reason he defeated, he didn't go onslaught like those men in arms. He would go what's now known in hybrid warfare. And this is a military term now. Fabian strategy is just to go, kill someone, defeat someone, betray someone, and so on, but until you get where you want. And correspondingly, the logo of the society was, the wolf and the, sheep's clothes. And, as an example, George Bernard Shaw was saying that they convert an editor of a magazine or of a newspaper, and by the time the capitalist owner realizes that, the paper publishes something for socialism, it would be just too late. So this is the approach he took. And what he said specifically, it's important for our conversation, he said, the important point is that the scholar who becomes a university president, sciences institute foundation, and so on, all rapidly cease to be scholars or experts and become intellectuals solely in the light of certain fashionable general ideas, fashionable at the time. So what he said, we need a fashionable an idea, which should be like a liberal utopia, liberal in economic sense, which is not too severely practical and confined. And in general, the idea was like this, and this is used by many. You have a theorist that says, this is what it is. Then you have think tanks that dissipate this idea, and SDI intellectuals, he called them second-hand dealers of ideas. So like people like us, we are second-hand dealers of ideas. We just hear something from a philosopher, translate it to masses, and this is how we can convert masses to think how you would believe. And when I started to sketch it, it turned out to be, the effort was much more complicated. It involved a bunch of very dedicated people. And it was really good that I read about it myself, because I just didn't touch label, I looked into life. And if you look at it, So it started with publishing this book about why socialism is bad in 1944. And it made him famous and infamous at the same time. He was hated by some so much that he was not invited, and the people refused to go to his, to have a lunch with him. He wasn't canceled and he wasn't fired, even though he worked in a socialist school. So the book was popularized in the United States, reduced to the format which I call smartphone format, even though smartphones were not available, because there were 18 saying here, this guy says, I'm a carpenter, I'm a plumber, I'm not a carpenter and plumber, so do what I say. Right? So this was the idea. If you go this road to socialism, you end up with this. But then effort just didn't limit with that, because this book allowed them to get introduced to people who gave them money, who really, for a conceptual reason. He found that just to give a few touches of what it involves, to give Mount Pelerin Society. In this society, 8 members became Nobel Prize winners in economics at that time. So it was a group of people who was discussed. Chicago School of Economics was started by him. This school received 1/3 of all Nobel Prize winners in economics. But the most important part in this Nobel Prize, the prize was introduced by 3 people, one of whom was member of the society. And the official prize, the official name of the prize is actually Swedish Riksbank. So Swedish Riksbank introduced it. Swedish Riksbank Prize in Economics in memory of Alfred Nobel. So it has nothing to do with Nobel itself, but good marketing shrunk it to a Nobel Prize in economics, and this was used as a big marketing tool. So the most important politically piece was to organize the first think tank, this Institute of Economic Affairs, Institute of Economic Affairs. And it was done by this man he graduated from Eton, then from Cambridge. During World War II, he was a fighter pilot. He saw his own brother, who was flying with him with the same escadron, shot down in front of him. So it was a very unusual person. So what he realized, what he did, he organized this small think tank. And this think tank published during 2 decades, I think around 3.5 million of words in 250 papers, just a few people. And they were, they were also holding lunches and discussions and all you can imagine. You can imagine done in an institute, like we have receptions afterwards. One of people who came to those receptions was a rising star in Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, so this first think tank expanded. By now it's 500 partners, what they call them, organized in one network, 164 think tank just in the United States. So, and when Margaret Thatcher, through all those parties, became familiar with all of this, and in 1974, Friedrich Hayek received the Nobel Prize in economics, and in 1975 she became the leader of opposition. It was a historic meeting between them. And as the person who organized this meeting wrote that she was sitting there in tents attending the master words. And some place cited me as like a schoolgirl. And this is usually she is quite combative. So she really absorbed it. And as a testimony, once she became the premier minister, he wrote Ralph Harris, the head of UNA and the organizer of this meeting, thanking him for that. And 2 months later, he became Lord Richard Harris. So it was a lot of things. Another direction was Ronald Reagan, who turns out to be a fan of Hayek. And besides being a fan of Hayek, a quarter of his administration, economic part of his administration, was members of Mount Pelerin Society. And the book that was called The Bible of Reagan's Administration was written by a member of the Manhattan Institute, which is another Mount Pelerin club. And some names like the Heritage Foundation, Cato Foundation you hear in the news, if you listen to news, are also from the same ilk. So it was, spreading everywhere, becoming like widespread and permeating everything. And at this point, I felt I'm paranoid. I'm just seeing things that are not there. And I was cured by this title because it said this IMF, International Monetary Fund, confronts its N-word being neoliberalism. So it turns out that the word is intentionally kind of dropped out of circulation by following, and I can say, like the Chinese wisdom, that the best leader is one whose existence is barely known. And then in this quiet, no shots fired, nothing done, to scare people, quietly, everything became converted. And in science, it became converted in this way. So scientists became sellers, articles, became commodities, journals resellers, publishing transaction, funders buyers, institutions plantations. Maybe plantation, I put some sarcasm in it, but in all other things, everything was done to better the development of humanity, for the future good of all people. And the question to ask, why not? And this is an important question for science. Well, it's just changed now. Let's just sell each other everything. Why not? And the first response, came from Andy Koff, and I showed him the manuscript on this topic. He formulated it, in his piercing mind. He just looked and said what I call the Koff Paradox. Because how can a market exist for that which is yet to be discovered? How can a market signal a need for something that is unknown to exist and impossible to foresee? It cannot. And those, if you ask, where's the discoveries, why there's no major discoveries, here's one of the answers. Which leads us to the next quote, which is, Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher, said, the difference between talent, that talent hits a target no one else can hit. And the genius hits the target no one else can see. Now imagine, it's difficult to convince a study section to give you money if you're talented and you're saying, I can hit that target. But how can you tell people sitting in the room that you want to have money for something that they don't see, right? It's quite difficult, but we all know, but this is how science develops, like somebody said that this is like storming a building. One guy gets on the floor, usually gets killed, but establishes a beachhead and then others spread. But the thing is then, if you need geniuses, who are they? How do they get their ideas, right? They don't come, they're not born with a tag, I'm a genius. And then, you look at another, a truly genius, Carl Jung, a psychologist, a really visionary. And he said, like what we know as scientists, that what we're interested in doesn't come because somebody told us to do it. It's something from within. For whatever reason you're interested, why cells crawl right or left, why the rolls, worms whirl, all kind of stuff that seems to other people weird. And why you do it, it's not known. His argument, and I agree with him, he said that creative person has little power in his own life. He's not free. He's captain and driven by his diamond, his spirit. So if you're in a situation that you need to explain your family that you really have to go now and your mice are dying and you're more concerned about them than about your children crying, this is where it comes from. It's some force that is driving you from within. And I think, if we recognize what this force is, we'll realize that what we know about humans is just, very, very primitive. So given that, when I think about pipelines mentioned that we say for MD, PhD workforce, this is the best picture I could find to reflect what I think. How do you get this kind of people within a drive and put them into something that you measure statistically, and what do you expect to come out? Pieces and bones, and so on. But this is an important question because you read those articles written by graduate students, a deadly academia machine, or tower that needs to be demolished, or you learn that half of them have depression, and this didn't exist when I came to the US, right? And it also tells you it's not single cases, it's something that is fundamental. It's a systemic effect. And then you look at any psychology website and it tell you that people who are bright are usually more intense, sensitive and idealistic. And they go crazy because they see the inconsistency, absurdities when they see around. And when you have a system that is set up in a way that is contrary to what science normally functions, because somebody thought about it, it had an idea, you can have quite a few of those absurdities to find. So, and what do, oh, it changes here, but it changes there. So, and what do the students are told? They're told that, you know, by really important journal Nature, my 11 part-time jobs made me a better PhD student. And the guy writes, I felt horrible at 6 a.m. when I had to go and, you know, bus tables, and then I have to go to the study thing. But, you know, this is, you know, it's very important. You learned important skills. I mean, I counted 9 jobs when I did through college and some graduate school. And I strongly advise anybody who could avoid it to do it. So then, you know, they tell you, sell yourself and your science in a compelling personal statement. I mean, maybe I'm just too old, but selling yourself in me associates with the second, you know, oldest profession in the world, and, you know, slave auctions, right? And I don't know, maybe they mean the next nature will tell us to sell yourself physically. I don't know. Maybe it's coming to that. So why? And then, says network connection failed. And then this brings us to the next important part, because so far everything we talked before was the economical arrangements between people, markets, and so on. But what Hayek also meant, and he was not hiding the implications of his ideas, he was not obfuscating it, he was straightforward, and he was telling it from this, you know, being a Nobel Prize winner and a person of authority. He said, we must, in our professional activities, no longer prefer the known good effects to the profits to be made, but must accept the profits as the signal which tell us how we can best help the masses of the population of the world alive. I mean, this is a typical theme. The world is dying, you know, the sky is falling, you have to do that. And this is, he was telling to a group of scientists, and, you know, he said, we must leave these inborn morals behind. Especially, he mentioned altruism and helping others. And except for our relations with our immediate circle, what is now called the nuclear family, observe what I have called the commercial morals. You think that this is, you know, I'm just citing some obscure guy saying this somewhere. But I mean, look at that. So this is from, you know, when COVID hit, you have why $80 hand sanitizer is a good thing for the markets. Right, not to people in the market. And here it goes. It says, when it comes to strangers, forget about Mr. Rogers. Price gouging is good. So we don't know how it got in our mind. And he clearly, you know, a nice person probably who is writing, he doesn't want to kill anybody, but this is what it is. So then, you know, how does it relate what happens to science? So there was this exchange at this, you know, where he was speaking. And it said, Professor Friedman asks him, if I'm indifferent to the ends of society and to others whom I don't know, why shouldn't I, for example, mock strangers? Why wouldn't this be rational, Professor Hayek? Because society would punish you for it, Professor Friedman. But isn't that simply an argument that I should be very careful when I mock someone? So then I thought, you know, look, if you just replace what he said, and you say, I don't know why shouldn't I, for example, massage data, to put it mildly. Why wouldn't this be rational? Because society would punish you for it. But isn't that simply an argument that I should be very careful when I massage data, right? And this is why, you know, if you read what's written, there's a whole field studying, you know, what they call irreproducibility crisis, and they trying to figure out how to do it, incentives and that. But this is the foundation. If you tell people, forget about morals. Your goal is to sell. The market will figure it out. And this is better for humanity because otherwise you will die. What are you going to do? Of course you're going to sell, right? Except if you are like 1/4 of populations who dislike it. So if you take it to medicine, you say, I will remember, this is from Hippocratic Oath, I will remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all fellow human beings, those sound of mind and body as well as an infirm. I will remember that there are art, medicine, as well as science, and so on and so on. But you are forced to add to it, and I will obey the demand of my employer to extract as much money from each patient as possible. Because this is your purpose in life. This is what you need to do for the betterment of humanity, for future survival. So then you look at this title, and it says, Goldman Sachs asks in biotech research report, is curing patients a sustainable business model? Of course, it's a stupid question. Of course, it's a wrong business model. Because you need to keep in mind, as Milton Friedman said, that few trends could be so thoroughly undermined. The very foundation of our free society is the acceptance by corporate officials of a social responsibility, other than to make as much money for the stakeholders as possible. This is a fundamentally subversive doctrine. So that analyst should be fired by asking stupid questions. So this is all implied in the system, and this is what we imbibe. Another thing, the F word here is funding. Because why I put it this way, not to bring your attention, but because when I was at one of the study sections, the officer there was saying, you are not supposed to say the word funding, because officially we are not selecting applications for funding. Officially, we're just evaluating science, even though everyone knew, of course, that we are selecting to know which one will be funded, which one will be not. So, and occasionally somebody blurts out funding, I want to fund this thing, and everyone laughs. So it was like a game. But it turns out, and this is a paper I stumbled into by a former Sovietologist in Britain who became, he was running a big fund, science funding, and so he knew what he was doing. He was good administrator. What he said, his Sovietology skills came back, because in Soviet Union, there were no officially market, but you need somehow to establish prices. So you create an organization that makes those prices out of thin air. So what he said in general happens if humans are put in a situation where they are forced to follow rules that they know are fake, they're not natural, and both who force it and both who are forced understand that they start playing a game of pretend. Everyone is pretending that, we're just doing this and that. And, then you have those planning indicators, then you have those indexes, then you have citation indexes, then you have, imitation of control, a documentation, tons of administrators to run all of it. But another problem that is, happening is groupthink, so-called groupthink, that will take us in a bit different direction. The groupthink is a word that was, it was introduced in 1970s to describe what French psychologist Gustave Le Bon found at the end of the 19th century. He wrote this piece called, Psychology of Crowds, and you can buy it on Amazon, and I strongly recommend it because in current environment, it's a thin book. But what it says, in my understanding, is the following. It says a crowd thinks and behaves as a single organism. A crowd thinks as the stupidest of its members, or is completely rational. A crowd can be virtual. At that time, there was no Twitter, but he said all is needed is for people to think that they are connected. And it's a mystery how it happens. A crowd wants simple solution and a leader. And scientists are not exempt from this rule. He says it specifically, except, he said, when they are at conferences. But being at many conferences, I can assure you, my view, it can go at conferences as well. And the goal of a scientific institution, given that this is applying to every, it's just part of human nature, is to create an environment where this is somehow alleviated. And the only solution that psychologists found is to have people who pipe up, who say something opposite. And importantly, it doesn't have to be something that is correct. It can be anything, but somebody has to pipe up. And the example that I think best illustrates it is, to me, found recently. It turns out here in Boston and Brigham and Women's Hospital, it was a major discovery made. And this discovery was, instead of keeping people who had a heart attack in bed for 4 weeks, from which they were not allowed to leave in the restroom, to put them in a chair. And this was discovery was made by Samuel Levine, who is the older guy here. And he had a young intern, Bernard Lone, and he gave this as a project to his intern. And the results were spectacular because the thing is that, as I understand, 1/3 of those people would die. And the number of days that the person would have to be in bed was shrunk, in a hospital, was shrunk eventually from 4 weeks to 3 days. Saving about, the calculations are about 100,000 people per year only in the United States. And somebody did a flip side calculations and figured that in the previous years, that doctor was still keeping patients in bed. They killed more people than died during World War I and World War II combined, right? I mean, it's a scary thing to say, but this is what it was. So the thing is, and obviously if you could read it, he said that, although I knew that the project would be a chore, I didn't expect it to be an act of martyrdom, because he was accused of being a Nazi, exterminating people and trying to kill them intentionally. And once he arrives to his medical ward, and all residents and interns lined up and gave him a Heil Hitler salute, telling him who he is. But he set up an independent clinic, and for the next, until he died, he was, running all those Nazi experiments, so to speak, there, and made a good of humanity for humanity. The opposite side of it is presented by this man, who is Trofim Lysenko, and he is known in the literature either by name or by the movement he created, Lysenkoism. And this is how he is described by a former rector of Moscow State University. His knowledge of practical agronomy, his fanatical certainty that he is right, his apparent actual sincerity made an impression. Against this background, the obvious absurdities in his statements were forgiven. And, he apologized that he thought that, this would be a transient event, but it didn't. It lasted for 30 years. And what lasted, that Trofim Lysenko, his idea, the absurdities were at the time, he thought that anything, any biological species is malleable. You can take one bird, take an egg from it, and for certain, cajoling, you can make another species of bird popping out. And you can do the same with grains and everything else, and so on and so forth. So everything is malleable. And at that time, the school of genetics in Soviet Union was flourishing. People were interacting, with foreign scientists. Everything was just going just well. Then, he started to pick them up one by one. Somebody got jailed, somebody got killed, somebody just got dismissed. And then en masse at the meeting, here is his addressing academicians, he said, these are the rules. These are your rights. Genetics, no good. Listen to what I say. He named his movement, Maturinist, known by everyone else as Lysenkoism. And if you agree with it, you can work. If you don't agree, you cannot. And then what started to happen, that it went down the chain of command. Things got, quite, methodical. People were removed from institutes, from councils, from editorial boards, and replaced, by people who knew what to say. All graduate students and all theses, everything was reviewed to be clear of genetics. My mother was at that time a freshman at the biology department, and he was so unimpressed that she switched to Department of Mathematics. And 3 decades later, when I told her I want to be a biologist, she said, Yuri, why don't you find a real profession? They're all idiots, They kill a rat and then they ask how the rat lived. At the same time, and I'm saying it for a reason, what was happening, the establishment, what the historians of the time said, the science bureaucracy, which transmitted what party bosses were saying into concrete decisions. And at the end, party ideologues no longer distinguish scientific concept from their philosophical interpretations and assume the role of judge in scientific discussion. And each field was assigned to a person to bear the rules. And people who disagreed with this kind of things were called racists and fly-loving, human haters, who just make flies instead of going and doing real stuff. As an example of what happened to one person. So this one was a professor chair for 32 years. He was fired because he taught his courses about, he was an expert in evolution of worms, because his courses in the spirit of bourgeois objectivism, uncritically presented the anti-scientific views, and so on and so forth and forth, and did everything in complete isolation from the practice of socialist building. So the thing is that rarely asked, why did what's happening? It was obviously happening because he was protected by Comrade Stalin, who was saying this is how things will be. But the deep reason was ideological, and it was articulated by Leo Trotsky, who said that the human race will not have ceased to crawl on all fours before God, kings, and capital, in order later to submit humbly before the dark laws of heredity and blind sexual selections. We need a new kind of man. And the need a kind of man translation is because if you have a doctrine that people don't like, you have a choice either to change your mind or change people. You start to changing people. So which brings us to science of modern time. And this is Mike Joyner, who I promised to introduce. And if you look at his Wikipedia description, he's a professor at Mayo Clinic, outspoken critic of reductionism in science, one of the most widely experts on the limits of human performance. And I also know, by knowing him for a decade, he can write a novel in the month. He is biking in Colorado over mountains, and he's a tremendous organizer. And so when the COVID hit, what happened? He teamed up with Arturo Casadeval from Johns Hopkins and a group of other people, and they tried to implement this idea and implemented it of collecting blood and make plasma from people who recovered from COVID and use it as a medicine for people who are immunocompromised, as basically a drug, an emergency drug to prevent people from getting AIDS, from getting COVID, people who could die. And the paper describes how, even though in the 60s, and they might spend the pandemic engaged in quieter pursuits, they basically were running till exhausted to organize this humongous network and coordinate with FDA and so on. And Mayo Clinic awarded him a Clinic Team Science Award for 21 exactly for that work. And a year and a half later, he received this letter that says, final written warning and 2-week unpaid suspension for violations and failure to comply with the expectation of tried above will result in termination of your employment. So, I chose this case because I know the person personally. I don't know, there's no hidden things there. And what were the requirements? The requirements were cease engagement in office conversation with reporters, discuss approved topics only, and stick to prescribed messages. It's literally stick to prescribed messaging, eliminating use of idiomatic language. So this generated, it went public. It generated a letter of protest for this thing written and signed by many very important people. Then a petition that's signed by some people sitting in this room. And then it went to newspapers, Mayo Clinic Medical College to doctors, sit down and shut up. Mayo threatens firing professor for interviews and idioms. Mayo Clinic accuses of placing academic freedom in jeopardy, doubles down and so forth. And I contributed for myself, just in remembering this road to, serve them cartoons that, modified it this way, like stick to prescribed messaging. I was appalled. I just imagined what happened, remembered how it happened to me when I was called to principal. It says, cut your hair there too long or we'll, expel you from school. Talking to a person like Mike, but what did he say? And I want to, it's kind of subsided now, so we can calmly look at it and ask, what did he say and why he was, so aggressively attacked? So the first one was an interview with CNN, where people were, and the interview said that some patients, advocates are angry and patients are furious because the NIH doesn't reply to messages from dozens of doctors throughout the state. And he said he's frustrated with the NIH bureaucratic rope-a-dope, calling the agency's guidelines wet blanket that discourages doctors from trying convalescence plasma. So they were upset that it, affects the image of Mayo Clinic. And, what I didn't find in the letter, it was not a single mention of a word patient. And this, can be understood, from what we discussed at the first part of the talk, is that, the Mayo Clinic, if they feel themselves as a corporation, this is not the main concern for them, the patients. The concern is to make money. So another conversation was about a controversial topic. It was a paper in New York Times, an article in New York Times about transgender athletes, and it's a very balanced and thoughtful paper, saying disagreements are profound, and Martina Navratilova, who is, I remember her from Soviet times, a retired tennis legend, a champion of liberal and lesbian causes. She said that, transgender female athletes possess insurmountable biological advantages, and they show the other side of the argument. They bring Mike Joyner in, and then at the end he says, well, the thing is that the effects of testosterone are lasting, and therefore there are social aspects to sport, but physiology and biology underpin it. Testosterone is the 80-pound gorilla. So this is why, and Mayer reacted that this is upsetting. But then, I read about it, and I thought, I looked on the subject, and I realized that the issue is controversial, as the journalist said. There are multiple opinions. So why to side with one of them if you're an institution? And then I started to think, but, what are those prescribed messages that Mike and others have to follow? How are they selected, by whom, and why? Why they are used as touchstone to figure out if somebody can do science or to cure people? Why is that? Then it made me also remember that, I received this, and from Springer said some time ago, they have this sex and gender in research guidelines. And it should apply to humans, vertebrate, animal, and cell lines. And, they say it should be done because authors should use the term sex and gender carefully in order to avoid confusing both terms. And after reading that paper, I went to philosophy encyclopedia at Stanford, and it says that these terms mean different things to different people. It's like happens in science in early times. People can fight about what is what forever. But then I also realized that the nature is fighting also on the side of the argument. And then Springer nature, which is, ate up nature now, Springer nature is a university commitment. It's a commitment to basically regulate how people are represented, what races are represented, and gender and so on in science, not in the stuff of nature. And this made me ask, who are Springer nature? And they are a private corporation owned, half of it is owned by a family, a German family, half of them by some investors, a sliver by Singaporean government. So I ask, isn't it strange that a privately owned corporation orders the authors of its 3,000 journals how to say certain terms that are not yet settled? They're still under discussion. Why would it do that? And when I started to look around and think about it, all fingers were pointing to what is known as critical theory. I read, I saw it in the news: critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical political theory, and I didn't know what it is. And given the Mike's case, I realized this is the time to figure it out. So what I did, I started to read it, and I came with very interesting findings. Because what he says is traditional theory. It's very simple. He described it really well. And basically, you have an idea, you test, agrees with the experiment or not. If it's not, it's wrong, or you need to retest it or correct and so on. But in critical theory, it's different. In critical theory, you start reading and they say, for men of critical thinking, the facts as they emerge from the work of society are not extrinsic to the same degree as they are for the savant, he calls the science like that, for members of other professions, all think like little savants. Then it goes that, it agrees with the view that, against adoring, against the adoration of facts and the social conformism they bring to it. Then he says that the real situation the facts are not regarded simply as data to be verified, but that every datum depends not on nature alone, but also on the power man has over it. Which brings me to mind just recent scandal here and also in Harvard, the two experts on dishonesty turn out to be faking data, like really crudely, with disregard to statistics in their paper. So then, he says that the theory is not independent of people who make it, and and the claim that some events are absolutely necessary means that you just don't want to change something. So what it comes down to is what I define as a doctrine, which means that you not test against facts. You just ask what somebody said, Marx, chairman of your department, and if he says yes, it's correct. If no, it's wrong. Now, what it also means is that we have a doctrine that is presented as science, and this doctrine, basically an opinion of someone, determines how scientists are regulated, what they do, and how. And as I was reading it, all my old stuff came up in my head from my Soviet times, and I felt I heard it somewhere. And it turns out I did hear it, and I remember it from childhood, literally. The slogan written everywhere, the Marxist doctrine is omnipotent because it is true. And if you ask, why is it true? The answer will be because it's omnipotent. And it's omnipotent because it's true. But at least Lenin said it succinctly what it is. What it means is that you make an opinion, and this opinion is a law. And then you go and change society to fit your opinion, which he did with known results. So then I thought maybe I'm again getting paranoid. Maybe it's all back and, who knows when he wrote this kind of stuff, this Horkheimer, and Lenin. But then I read this website, so it's Caucus for Critical Political Science. And then, what they say in the paper is that in opposition to critical theory, traditional theory cares about facts and knows there's difference between subject structure. And we shouldn't do it in critical theory because we'll generate passivity toward unfolding the social events, which I translated like this. So facts can make one reluctant to unfold and unravel the social and political world. And maybe think, maybe this is what it need be. But then you also ask, what is it for? And then you find that, what is it for? Is that because the argument is all this capitalist society will concentrate on exchange generates tensions. Tensions need to be removed to make people happy. To remove tension, you need to erase the society. And, even if natural privileges, which depend on individual talent, efficiency, continue to exist for a while, at least no new social privileges are to replace them in such a provisional series. And then it says everything has to be dictated, as Hayek warned. And importantly, it says the purpose of this model is not better functioning of any element of the structure. On the contrary, it's suspicious of very categories of better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable, as these are understood, and just need to be destroyed. So what we have in our hands is a theory that tells people that they need to destroy what they have for a better future. And again, Comrade Lenin said it straightforwardly, without 60 pages of philosophical text, says that the only one way of smashing the resistance of ruling classes is to find in the very society which surround us people who can do it. He saw the proletariats. So people from critical theory think that this is, people who are in culture, which is including science. And this experiment has been done, and we know about it, and it didn't end up well for China, at least. And we were warned against it by another philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who said in his what is called Message to the 21st Century. So let me explain. If you're truly convinced that there are some solution to the, basically, like Lysenko, if you're fanatically certain, right, that you're doing the right thing, and you can find this critical theory of the social justice. So no price can be too high to pay in order to open the gates of such a paradise. And only the stupid and malevolent will resist once certain simple truths are put to them. And those who resist must be persuaded and so on, if necessary, terror and slaughter. And Lenin believed in it. And if a just, peaceful, happy, free, virtuous society could be created by the means he advocated, then they unjustified any means that needed to be used, literally any. So what we have a very strange situation. We have this academia, perhaps too idealistically depicted by Raphael, and we have it bracketed with two competing ideology, because the ideology of critical theory wants to destroy what's created by the ideology of Hayek, and Hayek hates socialists, obviously. And we have three parts in the Frankenstein that are fighting each other, and what's happening to all scientists is this is what we feel. So it's something that is going not at the level of your interactions with your advisor, not interactions with your administrator. It's a fundamental problem with people's mind. Because institution is a it's a system of people's mind. You have all those three components in one case. And I'll finish by what to do quickly, because I don't have any recipe for nicer future. But what I do know, that I want you to be happy and enjoy life in science as I remember it, and you could say anything you want, unless you just really want to say something really rude to people. And everything was discussed, and marvelous things came out from it. All my good things that I did in science came out from, like, one discussion was a person sat in front of me and told me, "You don't know what you're doing, Yuri." And it's like, why don't we discuss? But in general, what happened, if you look back, science was a self-organizing scientific community. With some people, better, some people worse. It was somehow they interacted with industry, government, and everything fed each other. And I'm not describing a utopia, human relationship are never easy, but still. And then it converted in this vertical structure where each layer actually feels like they're a slave of a layer above it. So there is no, and the very top is scared that they get, something wrong, and everyone is scared that they say something and something happens to them. And I think, the common theme is that we still need to remember that we are scientists, and I include myself, that something is driving us that is, I'm not a religious person, but you can say godly. And we need to keep it in mind and trying to understand how we can go to the picture on the right to picture on the left. And we can discuss it at receptions, and you may have better ideas than I do. I just described one version of what could be happening now. But in general, if you think about that, what's happening to you is not happening just to you, but it's something that's happening to life around you. You're like a piece of sand in this whirlwind. It may help you to understand what to do, how to do it, what to fret about, what not to fret about. Focus on your mice, what helped you focus on my experience, and so on. And I'll finish with many thanks, Igor, my son.